Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to another episode of As I Live and Grieve. Again, I have to tell you that you have given me far more than I think I give you. You have helped me heal immensely. This podcast is now 4 years old. There are over 200 episodes out there, and I know there are listeners around the world. And that is something when I first thought of this podcast, first uttered the word, I never thought would happen. So thank you, everyone, for sharing, for blessing me with your support and your strength as well. With me today, I have a wonderful guest, and this is a topic that we don't often get to talk about for I don't know what reasons, but I've got a great speaker today. With me today is Annie Orenstein, or is it Orenstein?
Orenstein, you got it.
Orenstein. Okay, so thanks for joining me today, Annie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, good. It's my pleasure. I'm going to let you introduce yourself to our audience. So would you just share a little bit of your background?
Absolutely. So I'm Annie Orenstein, as you mentioned. So kind of professionally, my background is as a researcher. I'm not a therapist or a mental health professional. I'm a tech researcher, and I am also a bereaved sibling. I have two older brothers, and our eldest brother, Ben, was killed in Afghanistan in 2009. And after that happened, I went looking for something, a book, something that would help me with my grief, and nothing, I couldn't really find anything that resonated that was for Sibling. And years later, about 10 years later, approaching the 10-year anniversary, I kind of wanted to get to know Ben again and to have pieces of him back. And so I started this project that I thought would be maybe a book about him, and turned into a book about sibling loss, and really the book that I needed when Ben died. And that book came out in May. It's called Always a Sibling, The Forgotten Mourner's Guide to Grief. And it's very much based in research. I surveyed over 350 bereaved siblings and then did in-depth follow-up interviews with about 40 of them. And their stories are woven throughout the book so that I could talk about things that I hadn't experienced, different types of loss, different types of relationships. And the book is out now, and it's really focused on, the sibling aspects of grief.
Well, I have to tell you, it is in a pile on my nightstand. I do try to read every single book of the guests that I interview, but I don't read as fast as I interview. So I have skimmed through your book and can't wait to get to it. A couple of things that you mentioned that I kind of want to touch on first. So when you mentioned you were looking for a book, but you really couldn't find one that resonated with you. And at the same time, sibling grief is almost it's not disenfranchised, but I think it's something that people don't really think about when they think about grief. They think about loss of a parent, loss of a spouse or partner, loss of a child, but they don't think about loss of a sibling.
Yeah.
Yet it can be every bit as traumatic and devastating as any other form of loss by death. Now, was your brother serving in the military?
He was
at the time?
He was,
okay.
Yeah. He had been in the Army Reserves, and he was called up on a stop-loss order.
Okay. All right. Well, that's near and dear to my heart because my husband was retired from the U.S. Army.
Okay.
He served in Vietnam. So I kind of know what that experience is like in general. I have a brother who I love dearly who served in the Air Force during the Vietnam days, but he never left the States because his training was in helping to prepare pilots.
Okay.
So he was in the electronics and he worked on a lot of the flight simulators.
Okay.
So he stayed in the country. So I didn't have to experience that. The other thing I wanted to mention is we talk about when you lose your partner or spouse, you are a widow or a widower. There is a new term out there for parents who have lost a child. They're trying to bring to the surface the term peregrine.
I have not heard that. Peregrine.
That's a movement on behalf of Henry Cameron Allen, who actually the Cameron in his name, he had legally changed. Cameron is his son's name.
Oh, wow.
So he changed his name to honor his son and is adopting, if you will, that word peregrine to mean parents who have lost children. But there is no word for grieving for those who have lost siblings.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's an initiative you want to take. As well, there is no word for children who have lost a parent.
Right. Only if you've lost both parents, not if you've lost one.
Then you're an orphan. Right. Right. But not really a specific one. But so anyway, there are really some gaps out there in the world of grief. But for today, we're going to focus on the loss of a sibling. Stereotypically, many people think of siblings as having squabbles when they're children.
Mm-hmm.
But often, there are so many more times that you are so close to your sibling that a loss really impacts you in a way you hadn't anticipated. What were some of the things that you felt, either emotions or thoughts, memories, that came to you initially when you realized your brother was gone?
So what comes to mind is that first hour, when I heard the news.
Okay.
And I was convinced that he was not going to be okay. Right. So from the moment he was called up to deploy, I was trying to talk him out of it. I was sure something terrible was going to happen. And he, tried very hard to convince me that it would be fine. He would be fine. And we all tried to talk him out of going because it was a stop loss order. And he worked for a government organization. He worked for FEMA, and he admitted he could have gotten out of it if he wanted to. But he had been deployed once before, and his unit, and he was the captain of the unit, and his unit was going, and he needed to go leave his bed. And so as much as we tried, we couldn't talk him out of it. And I was convinced, I had a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. And when I got the news, my first thought was, no, this is not supposed to happen. I was supposed to be wrong. This is not supposed to happen. This is not supposed to happen. And I kept repeating that out loud over and over. This is not supposed to happen. This is not supposed to happen. And it was like everything, I had been so convinced it was going to happen. And then when it happened, I was like, no, I was supposed to be wrong.
Right.
And it was like everything went blank almost. Like I couldn't think clearly. I didn't know what to do, but I also didn't know what to say. I got the news. I was actually babysitting for my nephew, my middle brother's son. And my parents called my brother and told him, and he came home and told me. And after babysitting, I was supposed to meet up with a friend. And I remember calling my friend and saying, I can't meet up tonight. My brother was just killed. And she was like, oh my God. And I was like, I don't know, but I can't meet up tonight. There was I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. Everything felt wrong. I remember going outside and looking around and thinking how does everything look the same? How does everything has changed. So why does this all look the same? And it felt like there was blank. It was blank.
Right. And did it feel kind of like time stood still almost?
Yes.
Or not? Yeah.
Yes, it did. It did. And time in general became a very strange thing where everything moved it was like moving through quicksand just to try to exist. And yet, the farther out we got, every time I would say how long it had been, it was like, no, it couldn't have been that long. So it's like one of those things where it feels like time is moving so slowly, but then when you stop and look back and say how long it's been, you're like, how did that happen so fast?
Right.
And it just, I think our lives, and I know that a lot of people feel this, but our lives just were cut in half.
Yeah.
And there was life, before Ben died, and there was life after Ben died. And there's a very clear divide. And I think of that moment and, sitting in Sam's apartment and kind of sitting there, rocking on the couch saying this wasn't supposed to happen, as that was the moment when everything split in half. And the world after that was different. It's like when you put on sunglasses that have a blue tint or a green tint, whatever, and you suddenly look around and you're like, whoa, the world looks weird. It was like that. Everything was different. after that. And time was not the same. Memories were not the same. If I would try to think of a memory, it was like my mind was blank, like in the moment. I couldn't think of anything. And then in the moments where I was trying to focus on grad school, have a conversation with my boyfriend, oh my goodness, the memory hits. And you're like, no, don't, but it was like, I had no control over my brain or over when I thought about these things, crying on the subway because I would see his face in a crowd or something, or just for absolutely no reason, with no trigger. And it was, in a way, very terrifying.
Sure.
Because you're like, how am I ever going to regain myself after that?
Right. And how long has it been?
15 years.
15 years. Okay. About at what point did things seem to settle a bit? And I say a bit because things never really settle completely.
Yeah. It took a long time. I mean, I think it took a few years before there was any kind of settling, and then it was a few more years before I could, just think about his life and smile without thinking about the end of his life. And until I could kind of feel his presence and feel like a comfort there, I think there were a lot of years where I just felt like there was a Ben-shaped hole.
Right.
And that was what I focused on, was like the void. Okay. And I felt that for a lot of years. And then at some point, and it happened a lot when I started this project, it felt like I could, like the Ben-shaped hole was there and it wasn't getting any smaller. And I didn't really want it to get smaller, but it felt like I could start filling that hole with happy memories of his life and things that reminded me of him and things in the world that I could, smile at and see elements of him in. And I feel like I kind of started collecting those things, and like that hole, while it's still whole and it's still there, it's like stuffed. Now it's more stuffed full of the happy memories and things that I can now carry around. But getting there took years.
Yeah. And who was your primary support? Was it someone in your family, or did you have a close friend? You mentioned a boyfriend. Who was your primary support? Who could you just sit with or cry with? Did you have someone?
Definitely, I did. I would say my boyfriend, who is now my husband, we were long distance at the time. We were both in grad school, and I would fall asleep. We would be on the phone, and I would basically cry myself to sleep. And he would keep the phone line open in case I woke back up, which I didn't even know about for a while.
What a wonderful guy. I'm glad you married him.
And my best friend, who had been my best friend since I was born, so she had known my brother. She had actually known my brother longer than me because was my neighbor and 6 months older than me. So she knew my family before I did, which she would tell me when we were kids. But she was incredible. And her whole family, she has older siblings and they would very much step in. But she was one who would like show up at my apartment and do the dishes and like just help me become a human again.
Yeah.
And then my brother Sam lived in Brooklyn, and we lived very close to each other. And we would just kind of be together. Like, we wouldn't necessarily talk about it, but we would show up at each other's apartment for a hug. We would, hang out a lot, like those little things. And I think those were, and a good therapist, not a good therapist, but those, I was very lucky because I did have those people who would just sit with me while I cried and didn't require much of me.
Right.
And I know that my parents would have been willing to be those people, but I didn't want to put more grief on them. As a lot of siblings feel, it's a very common thing, right? Your parents are grieving a terrible loss and you don't want them to worry about you. You don't want to make it worse or harder for them.
And they were probably feeling the same about you. They didn't want to intrude too much on what you were going through because they wanted to give you some space too.
Yeah.
To deal with your grief in your way.
Yeah. absolutely.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Grief in families can be very complicated, and because initially every single person grieves differently. And then when you put them all in the same family, sometimes you are struggling with how someone else is grieving.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any issues within your family about how someone was grieving or not grieving? Seemed to be not grieving. Were there any issues like that came up?
I wouldn't call it an issue because I think that they handled it very well. But one thing, certainly that I noticed and eventually asked them about was with my parents. My dad found comfort in all of there would be military events honoring my brother and all of that. And he found a lot of comfort in that and pride. And my mom wanted absolutely nothing to do with anything military. I remember the Gold Star mothers showed up at a funeral and at the graveside, and my mom was like, "Don't let them near me." She felt like, and I shared this, brother since he was in the reserves and the army wasn't a big part of his life, it felt like the army was what killed him, not how he lived, and we were a military family. And so in the beginning, I think they would go to some events and not others. And then at some point, they just kind of acknowledged that it's helpful for my dad. It's not helpful for my mom. And so he would go and she wouldn't.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot from watching them navigate that because they typically do everything together. And so seeing them be able to acknowledge this is helpful for me, not helpful for you. And so we're going to support each other doing those things was really, I learned a lot from watching that. But that's, I think otherwise we were all, otherwise there wasn't a lot of conflict or differences. But I think after doing all of the interviews, I think that was unique. I saw it, I heard about it a lot in a lot of.
I agree. Yeah, so many times people do things because they feel obligated.
Yeah.
And I think it shows a great deal of strength on behalf of your parents that they were able to recognize in each other that the other person needed something a little bit different.
Yeah.
And they were able to respect and honor that and find a way to make it work. So I applaud that. And you can pass that on.
And I think they shared that with us, so they were living in Connecticut. My brother and I were in New York, and they would say, "There's this event if you'd like to come." And, my brother didn't like going, just never really went to the cemetery. And I asked him about it once, and he was like, "It just doesn't help me. I don't think he's there. I don't think about it that way. I don't find it helpful. So I just don't go." And no one ever put pressure on him to do that, even though I know that my parents go all the time and I go occasionally. And so I think we all did a good job of just respecting that we all needed something a little bit different.
I think that's wonderful. And it speaks so much to how you kids were raised in the beginning, that this earth-shattering, devastating event happened in your family, yet you all found your own individual ways and respected the others. Yeah. In what they were doing. So that's outstanding, actually.
Yeah.
And with the holidays, do you have any rituals? Does your family have any ritual to include Ben in the holiday?
So we're Jewish, which I think is helpful. Hanukkah's not that big of a holiday. And we didn't really do Hanukkah together anyway, or at least not as adults. But Thanksgiving and the 4th of July are holidays where we would always come together as a family and have traditions. And those have been really hard holidays. Sure. With 4th of July, this is a funny one, maybe. Ben loved fireworks, and he loved driving to a fireworks store and buying the weirdest ones. And then my parents live near a beach and just going and setting off fireworks on the beach. And Sam has really taken on that tradition. And now we all have kids. And so he's handing out sparklers and, the pooping dog firework. That my mom is really triggered by fireworks. They're loud sounds and explosions. So she stays in the house and is very supportive of everyone else going out, and she stays in the.
She finds her way to deal with it, yet she honored and respects that the rest of the family wants.
She doesn't want to stop us, but She doesn't want to join. With Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving was Ben's like favorite holiday. He loved the fall, loved pumpkin spice latte, anything pumpkin flavored. And so we definitely, we have that pumpkin pie for him. And on his birthday, we always do like with my kids. We'll do a pumpkin something like a pumpkin pie or pumpkin ice cream. And so we have little traditions like that. I think now, both as like a parent of young kids but also as a griever, like Christmas strikes me as a holiday that has like a lot of pressure on it.
It does.
And so I'm kind of glad that I don't have that's not something that we celebrate, because it really takes that pressure off.
Yeah. I love the ways that you have found to include Ben in your holidays. What do you tell your children about Uncle Ben?
Yeah. It's something that I stressed about for a really long time. So it's like, how do we explain this? And his death was violent and scary. And how do you explain war and, all of that? And they don't know. They know that he was a soldier and they know he was killed in war. They don't know it was a suicide bomber. They will at some point. But so far they haven't really pressed for details, but we talk about, we mostly talk about what he was like as a big brother and as a person. And, we have pictures around, and I tell them stories about my childhood and what my big brothers were like and what they did. And so I try to really focus on what he was like as a person. And, if they do something that reminds me of him, I'll tell them about it. And it just, like, when you hear my son talk about him, you would assume that they knew each other. At school on Veterans Day, I guess he got really emotional and he talking about his uncle. And when I talked to the teacher afterwards and I explained that they had actually never met, she was like surprised at the way he was describing him. And I loved that. Like, on the one hand, I'm like, oh, did I like make my son grieve someone he doesn't even know? But the fact that he feels that attachment is really special. And I know that Ben would have been an incredible uncle. And so I'm glad that Archie knows that too. And sometimes he'll say, like, I really wish I got to meet him. I wish I got to know him. And I'm like, yeah, me too.
But it sounds to me, in my unsolicited opinion, that you certainly have not made your son or your children grieve Uncle Ben, but you have helped them celebrate their Uncle Ben.
Yeah.
And I think it's one way of having his presence always with you and always with your family, because in years to come, even as you grow much older, which I have to tell you, unfortunately, it's going to happen, honey. There's no way around it. But at some point, you're going to look at your children, and maybe especially your son, and he's maybe going to tell his kids about his Uncle Ben. And that is going to touch you in a way that you cannot imagine.
Yeah.
You don't realize. I know for me, after my husband died, and my husband was not the biological grandfather for my two grandsons, but my younger one, AJ, I want to say he was in 6th grade, and they have a project. They're in a baccalaureate school, or were. He's much older now. And they had a project to do, and I didn't realize it, but AJ chose to do his on Agent Orange. And that came to be what they determined was the actual cause of my husband's brain tumor. Service in Vietnam. And I went to watch AJ speak. Now, I didn't think that Tom's death had impacted him very much. But here in 6th grade classroom, in front of parents and teachers and administration, AJ is telling the story of Agent Orange and then telling the story of his grandpa, his Iha, as they called him, and showing pictures of him in the military.
Wow.
And sobbing. Just sobbing and having to stop. It had the entire audience in tears. It really did. But I hadn't realized until that moment exactly how much Tom meant to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that even though your son, your children didn't meet Ben, they carry that love in their hearts.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my very, very favorite quotes ends, I think it's by Jamie Anderson, and the one that was my light bulb moment was that grief is merely love with no place to go.
There's a book called Grief is Love by Marissa Renee Lee, and she describes grief as unrequited, unconditional love.
Yes.
And when I read that, I was like, oh my God. It was, and at that point, when I thought about it that way, I thought, well, that's why this den-shaped hole that's why I want to keep it. That's why it's never going away, because if my love for him wasn't going to ever go away. If he was alive, why would it go away now?
No, exactly.
And it's that unrequited, unconditional love. And I think it is, when you think about it that way, it makes all the sense in the world.
And it did to me. As I say, that was my light bulb moment. I still have this love for Tom. I just I don't have him to give it to.
Right. You're like, where do I put this?
Exactly.
And it can be really, I think the turning point for me, we were talking earlier about like this turning point. And I think the turning point for me was when I could start feeling his love for me again.
There you go.
When it didn't feel as unrequited, when I started to see things around me that reminded me of him and his love for me and how much he smile. And it was when I started feeling that love back from him where I was like, okay, I can do this.
Yeah. When you allowed yourself to feel it. I think because we block it for a while. We're so hurt and so broken ourselves that we block that capacity to receive that love. So that's a dynamic point right there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, unfortunately, Annie, our time is winding down. This is the part in my podcast where I always turn the microphone over to my guests. So here's the microphone. The floor is yours.
Well, if you are a grieving sibling or supporting a grieving sibling in any way, please consider picking up a copy of the book, Always a Sibling, The Forgotten Mourner's Guide to Grief. It's available bookshop.org, Amazon, everywhere books are sold. And you can find me on Instagram at Annie Orenstein.
Okay. And as always, her contact information and certainly the book's title will be available in our podcast notes. I want to add something that she has a website, and there's a tab on that website called Dispatch from what?
Daybreak. Dispatch from Daybreak.
Dispatch from Daybreak. Could you tell us about that for a quick minute before we sign off?
Yeah, that's a platform that I founded a few years ago. That's a space for women to share stories and share letters to their earlier selves. Kind of when you're looking back and you think, I wish I could go back in time and tell this to younger Annie. And so it's a collection of letters written by women to their earlier selves.
And they are beautiful letters. They are amazing letters. So if you're just looking for a break in your day, go to the website and look for Dispatch from Daybreak. It was very touching. It touched me. I haven't read all the letters, but I've read a bunch of them. Annie, I read yours. So touching.
Thank you.
So I thank you for taking time today to chat with me. Thank you for your eloquence in expressing how it feels to lose a sibling, yet to keep that sibling in your heart, in your mind, in your memories. And as I said, your book is on my nightstand. I'm going to get to it eventually, and I can't wait. Out of all the losses in my life, I've experienced loss of parent, loss of an infant son, loss of my husband. I tell my brother, my one and only brother, that he has to hang around for a long, long time because I have no desire to experience his loss. I certainly am not ready for it. So we tease each other all the time about, you're going to go first. No, you're going to go first. It's like that old mom loved you best. Yeah. It's like that old argument, but we've kind of put a different spin on it. So anyway, thank you so much, Annie. And to our listeners out there, please consider purchasing a copy of the book, visiting her website, thinking about it, and just considering that when you lose a sibling, it is every bit as devastating as every other type of grief out there. Remember to take care of yourselves above all else. It's like that analogy on the plane. Put your own oxygen mask on first. Take care of yourself so that you can help others out there that are grieving. Heaven knows we all need help, and not just on day 1, but on day, 1272. Everybody needs help. Take care of yourselves. Come back again next week as we all continue to live and grieve. Thanks again, Annie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.